You all could definitely let me know. Okay.
Don't see anything yet, but okay.
We're live.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And once again, welcome to another vibrant, exciting, interactive discussion on Chat with the Frat. Here we are now. I think this is about our 10th Chat with the Frat. And today is going to be absolutely exciting and engagement. Why is that? Because we are dealing with facing the COVID vaccination controversy, a cause for historical concern, really a historical cause for concern. This is part of a two-part series. The first one, because we recognize that there is really a need to put the COVID-19 and the vaccination and testing into a historical context before we move on to next week to allow the doctors and other health professionals talk about the vaccinations as well as the medical testing. So we are exceedingly excited today. Last week, as you all know, was just an absolute awesome discussion. Why? Because we covered behind the numbers, in which Brother Henderson Johnson and Dr. Banks really uncovered, unfolded, and took us through helping us understand what the COVID-19 numbers meant for us as African Americans. And it's only appropriate that the week before that, we had the epidemic within the pandemic. And it's amazing how much has changed and has unfolded in that short period of time. There we were having a detailed, intensive conversation about Ahmaud Arbery, and between that time and this time, we are now dealing with another death, untimely death. And so it enforces the concept that the epidemic within the pandemic continues. And so there's a lot taking place and a lot is unfolding. My name is Dr. Gary White. I am the licensed social worker, therapist, educator, and social activist. And I'm excited to be a part of this interdisciplinary team of brothers from Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, Omicron Phi Lambda chapter. And that interdisciplinary team consists of dynamic brothers such as Dr. Darren Wright, Brother Marcus Dumas, Doctors Terry Dickerson and Leroy Graham, Dr. Christopher Bass, Brother J. Kyle Bryant. We are excited about the work that we're doing and what we're literally going to engage in on today, taking that deeper look at vaccinations within a historical context. But before we do that, today is also a very important, significant week here for our chapter. And I'm going to turn that significant time period over to one of our newest brothers in the chapter, Brother Wright. What's so significant, Dr. Wright, about this week in the work that we're doing? And I know, go ahead, let me unmute you, Dr. Wright.
Thank you.
What's significant about this week?
Thank you, Brother White. This weekend marks our 33rd Charter Day or Founders Day. And so we're excited to celebrate 33 years of excellence in our community. And it's a pleasure for me as being a neophyte to be a part of this great chapter among such excellent men as we continue to engage in manly deeds, scholarship, and a love for all mankind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright. And so again, we are excited to continue to do this work within this dynamic week of celebration. And so now on to the all too important discussion that we are engaging in, again, facing the COVID vaccination controversy, a historical cause for concern. And once again, as we shared, we have to put this entire discussion within context. So our dynamic speakers for today, and I'm going to tell everyone to follow us on South Fulton Alphas. I'm going to invite everyone to like our page and take a look at some of our other links. But we have Dr. Darren Wright, who's going to put in context, a historical look in terms of African American community is the experimentation and testing for our community. Followed by that, we have Brother J. Kyle Bryant, who is going to really look at the intersectionality in terms of the cultural communication, how we are communicating, what is being communicated with regard to the testing and the vaccinations, and he's going to put that thing within a cultural context. Followed by that, we have our guest, Dr. Oliver Richmond III, who's going to talk in more detail about medical ethics. This is something that we have to take under consideration because it's all definitely interconnected. Followed by that, we have doctors, Dr. Leroy Graham and Terry Dickerson. They're going to talk about this thing called the Hippocratic Oath and what is literally intertwined within that piece, that especially doc, that notion of do no harm. And so we have to take a look at that because historically, this country has not abided by that concept. And that's why we thought it was critical to certainly put it within a historical context. And then finally, clinical psychologist, Brother Dr. Christopher Bass is going to bring it home by making it clear, helping in context, put in context, literally the paranoia, the historical paranoia and concern that we have. One of the things that we recognize is that our concern is truly, truly valid. And so Dr. Bass is just going to certainly delve in a little bit more within that context. So everyone get ready. We're ready to, for lack of a better word, we're ready to make history, and we're certainly ready to engage in this O2 important discussion. So I'm going to go right on into it. And I want to go right on to Dr. Wright. Brother Wright, you ready for us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good. So definitely if everyone sees my screen, I think we're just about ready to delve into it. Dr. Wright, so we begin with you. And when we begin with you, we're having a conversation in terms of understanding this entire notion of testing and why, as African Americans, historically, we have that level of concern. So if you don't mind for us, Dr. Wright, take the time and put this thing in historical context.
Thank you, Brother White. So as you can see, I titled this part of our presentation, introduction here, is just a historical overview of race-based medical research among African Americans, because I think it's important for us to understand where that's coming from. So the areas of concern. So from very early in our history, all too often we begin our discussion around these medical testing, primarily beginning in the late 30s, early 60s, talking about the Tuskegee experiment. But we really have to go back further than that. And as you can see from the works done on medical apartheid by Harriet A. Washington, it's a book I recommend that each and every one of us that are on this chat and for our listening audience to take a look into her work as she begins to talk a little bit about some of these incidences prior to that. So one of the things I think you can see, I did some research, and here we have a journal from way back in the 18th century, the Southern Medical and Surgical Journal. And they did a lot of work in terms of medical experimentation on African Americans. And this is one of the earliest journals that I found in the earliest journals. But if you go through this particular journal, this volume, more than half of the discussions, the research findings, the research procedures were done on enslaved African Americans without their consent, oftentimes, or without their knowledge. But what were some of the things that they found? One, they would keep drawing assumptions that somehow Blacks could withstand pain and did not experience anxiety. Another thing that resulted from that was that, therefore, they never sought consent or communicated effectively about the risk or rewards associated with clinical trials because these were individuals who were enslaved. So we're dealing with an issue, we're dealing with a culture, we're dealing with a mindset and an attitude that predated the works of Jester Tuskegee or Miss Larks as we look at her studies as well. Recent studies, and this is as recent as you can see, Dr. White, as 2016. If you look at that Hoffman, you see what? With those studies that there was an assessment of racial bias in pain assessment and treatment recommendations and false beliefs about biological differences between Blacks and whites. These are recent studies in 2016. So while we believe some of the attitudes have changed, they have not, in terms of how these past attitudes and behaviors still continue to plague our community as it relates to testing, research among African Americans and people of African descent, period. Can we go to the next slide? So I think we have to have that context again. So here you can see I just list some early events that acted as precursors to race-based medical research with people of African origin. One, Bartholomew Las Casas, one of the earliest advocates for or champions for the rights of indigenous people or native indigenous Americans in the Americas, right? Whether it's North America, South America, Latin America, the Caribbean, he was one of the advocates against the enslavement of indigenous people, but the enslavement of African people. And again, on that pseudo-science basis that what Africans were better equipped to deal with the rigors of slavery, one, and that Africans had a higher level of threshold when it related to pain. So here again, these guys acted as a precursor that set the attitude and the mindset around the lack of ethics that we saw in medical trials. The picture below you see of King Badu Bonsu to your right. That is actually the head of the king of what is one of the many ethnic groups in the Ga region of present-day Ghana. He was beheaded because he resisted against the enslavement of the Ga people and of the Fanti people of that region. His head was severed and taken back to the Netherlands for scientific research. It was not returned to the Ghanaian people and the Ga people until recently, I think it was in 2016. So that picture you see is of the people of his ethnic group, the chiefs, standing there as they're signing paperwork to retrieve the head of the king. So this issue of using Blacks, using people of African origin to engage in unethical scientific research has a long history that predates the Tuskegee experiments. Can we move forward? So I want to provide a snapshot of that historical timeline so that we can see that this distrust that has developed among African Americans and other people of African origin has a long history and it's valid. And I know that when Brother Bryant and our other speakers go into, they'll speak a little bit more into this, but I wanted to give us a snapshot of that. As we can see, this whole issue in the 17th century, scientific polygenism, where we see in the 17th century, people as David Hume and Voltaire literally kicking out what is called then evidence-based journals regarding the inferiority of Africans and the superiority of other races, and at the helm of this were the Caucasian race, and how that in itself set this trend for this medical bias, these attitudes to develop within people of European descent, particularly here in the Americas. We also see the works of Marion J. Sims, who was an American physician and a pioneer in the field of surgery. He is known as the modern father of gynecology. So in terms of the practices that we see in gynecology that are practiced currently, those practices were developed without consent from enslaved African-American women in the South. And mind you, he never used anesthesia when he performed those operations. Because again, what was the evidence base back then, Dr. White? That what? African people had high levels of threshold to withstand pain. Therefore, they did not need anesthesia. You know, we have a running comment that evidence-based based on whose evidence? Then we see, again, in the late 18th and 19th century, really the kickoff of scientific racism. And we have individuals such as Brian Benjamin Rush, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and he was the dean of the medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, and is often cited as the father of American psychiatry. He described Negroes as suffering from an affliction called negritude. Further, we have the likes of Dr. Samuel Cartwright, because you know, my foci, my area of practice is behavioral health, mental health. And I worked in this area for over 25 years. He came up with a scientific explanation for if Africans ran away from the plantations in the South and the Caribbean, that they suffered from drapetomia. So these were the attitudes that existed. And people publish these things. These attitudes just don't disappear. Even though they have been discounted, the attitudes exist. As we've seen from recent studies there, people are still citing that people of African ancestry have higher levels of pain tolerance in 2016 and are less likely to be given medication when faced or reporting pain when reporting to their doctors. And then we come up to the 20th century and we see studies such as the Tuskegee study, where untreated syphilis in African-American males, and again, this is often cited. This is often what is used as the only incidence, and oftentimes people will try to then devalue or invalidate the fears of African Americans and other people of African descent by saying, look, this was an incident that happened one time. I've just shown that this incident, this is a beginning way back in the 15th century with the works of Bartholomew Las Casas. So here we see again, when we see what the issue with Miss Henrietta Lacks, African-American woman from East Baltimore, who again, parts of her body was removed without her consent. And while we were able to find treatments for certain diseases as a result of that, the main fact is that she was never informed, nor her family. And these incidences continued on even into the 60s with the forced sterilization of Black women, particularly in the South, where individuals were sterilized unbeknown to them. And as we can see, heading up into the 20th century, currently, there's this huge push, this huge movement of doing a lot of testing in third world countries, particularly in Africa. And as you can see, I've laid out just a few of studies that have happened in the third world, particularly in Nigeria, 1990, the testing of meningitis. 15 or 20, I forgot how many people died, but there were riots in Nigeria because of that. Zimbabwe in 1990, and then Cote d'Ivoire, where placebo was given, where there was a known preventive, where individuals would not protect the HIV positive moms from contracting HIV/AIDS. It was withheld from them in a placebo test. Now, again, I know our doctors are going to speak to us a little bit about medical ethics and the concern around that. So recently we've seen with the recent issues of COVID-19, a videotape was leaked with two doctors from France having a conversation about doing the testing of COVID-19 vaccines in Africa among their former French colonies. We saw huge uprisings in Cote d'Ivoire. I think there were a few centers burnt down in Senegal, and I think somewhere in Nigeria as well. So again, we see this continued issue, and as a result of that, there is an issue around trust for medical ethics and what physicians and other researchers will do as it relates to people of African descent and specifically African Americans.
Wow. What can I say? Dr. Wright has truly, absolutely, without a doubt, put this oh too important discussion in context. Certainly bringing home a clearer understanding of why this concern for vaccinations and testing has hit so hard within the African American community. But that's just the first part. Again, what we are arguing, and of course, the critical point that we are making here is that we have to understand why the community has the level of concern that it has with regard to testing. And so now, once we kind of move from there, we get ourselves to another important discussion here, and that piece is within the context of the cultural communication, what we discuss and how we dialogue with regard to COVID-19. And so now we're going to turn this part of the discussion over to Brother J. Kyle Bryant. Got a couple issues here. We're going to turn this part of the discussion over to Brother J. Kyle Bryant to further engage in this aspect of the dialogue. And Brother Brian, I'm trying to get the screen up, so if you don't mind, go ahead and get started. And I'm going to wrestle with this thing while you do it. Are you able to see my screen, Brother Brian?
Actually, yes. I think whatever you did. Hold on. I can see it now. I can see it now. Yeah. So I'd just like to say what I'd like to talk about as it relates to this topic is basically I want to talk about a working definition of what culture is and then cultural competence, because what we find is many of the regulatory bodies, agencies, public health institutes and things, federal, state, local regulatory bodies, especially during something like an epidemic or a pandemic, they utilize an incident management structure to deal with mass issues. And so there's just sort of guidelines that they use to have an understanding of dealing with cultural competence or dealing with at-risk communities or diverse communities, because many of the technical agencies, at least on the federal level and the state and local levels follow suit, have been the technical agencies that are public serving agencies, have been the last ones to ever diversify their staffs. And as a result, there's always been a lack of understanding of how to deal with our communities. So let me just start by giving you a general understanding of what I'm talking about. Culture, first of all, is defined as the thoughts, communications, actions, customs, beliefs, values, and institutions of racial, ethnic, religious, or social groups. So to be culturally competent doesn't mean that you're an authority in the values and beliefs of every culture, but what it means is that you hold a deep respect in for cultural differences, and you're eager to learn and willing to accept that there are many ways of viewing the world. So that being said, as the U.S. becomes more diverse, just as public servants in any other field, like in the regulatory process, clinicians or doctors as well, increasingly will see patients with a broad range of perspectives regarding health that are often influenced by their social or cultural backgrounds. Forbes did a study back in 2008 and cited that by the year 2023, 54% of all babies born in the US will be Black and brown babies. And everyone knows about that study that showed by the year 2040, Black and brown people will be the majority in this country. This puts our regulatory agencies and our healthcare industries at an impasse because they have not been the target of research and studying our health conditions as a majority, because we have not been the majority. And we are going through this awkward transition phase now. Research has shown that provider-patient communication is linked to patient satisfaction, adherence to medical instructions, and health outcomes. Poorer health outcomes result when sociocultural differences between patients and providers aren't reconciled in the clinical encounter. This means when our people go to the doctor, if there's some impasse in that the doctors don't know how to speak to our communities, or they have preformed misconceptions about us, then that impacts the quality of service that they get. These barriers don't apply only to minority groups, but they may simply be more pronounced in certain cases. So effective communication depends on how all parties in the interaction behave and how this behavior is perceived by both the viewer, the listener, or the speech partner. This takes place when participants in the interaction have developed not only respect for diverse interaction styles, but when they have developed multiple interaction skills. And like I said before, most of the technical public service agencies, including the medical and health fields, has been slow to diversify as opposed to some of the other non-technical public service type agencies in terms of overlooking how these institutions are trained and how they are recruiting a diverse work group to meet the needs of a 21st century America. Clinicians should start by recognizing their own culture and how the culture of medicine might lead to unconscious biases. This is something doctors could do, or look at how their own culture as physicians lead to maybe inappropriate and excessive use of medical interventions or stereotyping. But the main thrust of culturally informed care should be to focus on the patient as an individual and not a stereotype, as a human being facing danger and uncertainty, not a mere case, and as an opportunity for the doctor to engage in essential moral task and not an issue of cost accounting. So this is just what I wanted to share with everyone, and just look forward to the continued dialogue going forward.
Thank you very much, Brother Brian. So certainly, as you will see from that historical context to this notion of cultural communication, certainly what Brother Brian is emphasizing here is how we are communicated to with regard to these matters become absolutely critical as an intersection in terms of our level of comfort with engaging or participating in the clinical trials, as well as the matter of vaccinations. And here's one thing that we fully recognize, and I should have certainly said this: the views toward the clinical trials and vaccinations is just as diverse as there are the diverse professions that are here on this line. And so the notion that we're actually all on the same page literally kind of radically differs from brother to brother. But what we do recognize is that the cornerstone of this is the discussion around medical ethics and the concerns and issues associated with medical ethics. And so we have, as well as that and other issues, we have Dr. Oliver H. Richmond III. I have to make sure I get that right, Brother Richmond III, to talk with us a little bit more than this. Again, ladies and gentlemen, what we're doing is we're putting this in context, because by the time we get to next week and the doctors talk about clinical trials and vaccinations and whether or not we should or should not be participating in it, we recognize that it is critical to put it first within a historical context. So, Dr. Richmond, it's on you.
It is on me. Good evening, brothers and ladies and gentlemen that are following. So I'm going to talk with you briefly about the ethics of healthcare practice in research or in clinical trials. And this is a document that was established essentially out of a probe for answering the question of what is the basic, or how can we identify the basic principles that are ethical that can protect our human subjects, so men, women, children, or babies, as we conduct biomedical or behavioral research or practice medicine. And this largely comes out of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1974. And you may know different iterations of it. For example, the Nuremberg Code or things that come out of the Geneva Convention when we're at war. But specific to these United States, the practice of medicine is traditionally identified as interventions that are done more so to increase well-being of the patients. Whereas research applications or the scope of medical research is usually identified as a body of academic work which is designed to test a hypothesis or evaluate an overall process of thinking. And so I'm throwing that out there because I want you to understand that there is a very real difference between what is considered research and what is considered medical practice. And they're not always the same. Unfortunately, at times there is some overlap between the two. And that's when things become blurred, those lines become blurred and the areas are gray, and decisions can happen or be made where your best interest may not be always considered. And with that, I do want to emphasize that your best interest is one of the main reasons for this body of data. And there are three overarching components to this. So first is the respect for volunteers. So whether this is research or whether this is a clinical evaluation in a real medical practice, you are not a patient until you have given your full consent. And you cannot provide your full consent until you fully understand the terms of what you are engaging. So that is to say, with respect to your language that you understand and that you fluently speak, with respect to your level of education, and then with respect to the scope of the research. What are the overall attainable goals here? How long is this going to take place for? What am I expected to contribute? Things like that. Before you are to engage in this type of research practice, it is expected that someone has sat down with you at least once, often more than once, and made certain that these guidelines, that these parameters are very clear to you. And when someone is explaining this information to you, it should be explained in a way that you fully and thoroughly understand. And then you should be in turn provided an opportunity to ask questions so that you are fully aware and that you are fully on board with what it is that you are about to embark on. To that caveat, you have full opportunity to resign or withdraw yourself at any point in time of this practice, of this research. And so the next principle for that would be from a beneficiary analysis. So what is the risk benefit ratio here? What is this going to cost me? How dangerous is this to me? How much of a threat is this to me? And that's a question that will be asked on the basis of you as an individual participating in some research, and then what the overall potential outcome is or gain in additional science is for the global or the world community. So with respect to the individual that will be enrolling in that research trial, and then with respect to the greater population being studied or offering this information to the world, what is this? What are the overall perceived threats here? And then what are the potential threats that could arise? How would we deal with those threats? These are things that should be explained to you prior to your consent, and then prior to you engaging in the actual research itself. Sometimes there will be financial compensation, sometimes there won't be financial compensation. Which brings me to the final overarching point, justice in itself. So for this to be fair or ethical or equitable and equal across all populations, the code is designed, or the policies are designed to get away from what we reviewed earlier, which is preying on populations that are considered overall weaker, or preying on populations that may not understand fully what's going on, or may not be intellectually aware of the full risks that are involved here. And so as a way to protect those individuals, these policies are put in place and then are stressed so that there's overall fairness in selection. So for example, we have a historical context in the United States of conducting so many human trials on prison populations because they're there. They can't go anywhere. It's easy follow-up. I have access to them. They have very little say. Or I can provide them these small incentives as if, they may get more outside time, or they may have, a better quality meal, things like that. But it's at great risk to their overall mental, physical, or emotional health. And that's a problem. So the ethics of medical practice exists to protect you or I as individuals when we choose to engage in medical research. That's important because what you will hear about a little bit later is that while from a historical context, there have been a number of slights that have misrepresented the efficacy of medicine or research with respect to our population. There are positive things that can come from us participating and supporting research purposes. We can gain multiple insights on how to best move forward as a population and as a world. We can also gain multiple insights on how best to protect ourselves and our community by better understanding what it is that is required, how we can best practice and participate in the clinical trials, and then how we can help shape and mold the trials that are to be conducted and ask questions that pertain to us. And so with that, I just want to wrap up and reiterate that the ethics of medicine practiced in research or in clinic is basically centered around the clause of do no harm, which is an oath that practicing physicians take before they assume that role, that licensure, to ethically practice medicine in the United States.
Wow.
As alluded before, there are some individuals that escape that boundary and they take their trials or their research to Africa, where there's no overhead, no governing body to oversee that. But yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, that absolutely sets the tone. We talk about this Hippocratic oath. We're talking about the physician's responsibility to that oath. So we got Dr. Graham, we got Dr. Dickerson up here before us because, again, you said something, Doc Richmond, that is a little nerve-wracking, and it's actually kind of connected even to what Dr. Wright said, and that's this notion of going overseas to run some of those experiments. And these, again, are all the things that we take under consideration as Dr. Bass will talk about and bring in context why we have this level of paranoia. But Dr. Graham, tell me a little bit more about this physician's responsibility with regard to these ethics that Dr. Richmond was talking about.
Absolutely. First, let me just commend the three brothers that preceded me. I've been a doctor for 42 years, and they succinctly put it better than anybody that I ever was taught by. And I have 2 boards, I'm a subspecialist and all that good stuff. So as alpha men always do. But first, a little piece of history. We refer to the Hippocratic Oath. Hippocratic Oath is, by most historians, honestly, a ripoff of Imhotep's work. Imhotep was an Egyptian physician in 2600 BC.
Oh shoot! Hold
Hippocrates,
on, Dr. Graham. Wait, hold on. You about to drop this thing now? Go ahead. I was expecting it. Where you going right now? I'm gonna interrupt you, but I was expecting Wright or Brian to drop this thing. But I'm gonna shut up right now because you're the physician. So go ahead and give us the origin of that concept.
Okay, so basically, Imhotep was known as an architect. He extracted medicines from plants. He gave care, and he thought he should do it with social responsibility. 2,200 years later is a period of Hippocrates. I don't think any more needs to be said. When we look at the Hippocratic Oath, we see in people that have studied Imhotep and things that are ascribed to him, basically a ripoff of that, okay? So I'm sorry if I stole anybody's thunder, but I needed to make that point. I'd like to share, though, and the brothers hit it so well, I'd like to share just some phrases in the Hippocratic Oath. We speak of respecting hard-won scientific gains of those practicing physicians. We talk about the benefit of all measures that are required, avoiding those twin traps of overtreatment and therapeutic nihilism. We believe that there's an art as well as a science to medicine, and we believe that we are not to be ashamed to say, I know not, or I will fail to call in my colleagues when the skills exceed my reach. We believe in the privacy of patients, and with care in matters of life and death, it is given to me to save a life, but it is within my power to take a life. I do not treat a fever chart, a cancerous growth, but a sick human being whose illnesses may affect person's family and economic stability. My responsibility includes these related problems if I am to care adequately for all the sick. I will prevent disease whenever I can, for prevention is preferable to a cure. If I do not violate, may I enjoy a long life in art, and this is almost taken literally from Imhotep, respected while I live and remembered with affection thereafter. That, my brothers, is what we physicians take upon graduating from medical school. The advances, as great as they may be, have developed a degree of sophistry. I mean, science is great, but we forget this is an art. We forget that we practice in the trust of the patient and that we owe that patient basic human dignity. And the brothers laid out with just awesome, authenticity about how this has been violated over time. But I would just say this and let my other brother get a chance to talk. As we will talk next week, it is so very critical that in the context of informed consent, and that means that we know all the good and all the bad, the intent, the hypothesis, and what we're looking for, that we do participate in medical research and vaccine trials, because the study of pharmacogenetics has literally exploded within the last 50 to 60 years. The best example I give you, brothers, is that, I'm 66, I got hypertension well controlled on 3 drugs, okay? When I was born, it was all about a diuretic or a water pill. It's been pretty conclusively proven that we don't work that way and that we have to be on alpha or beta blockers or ACE inhibitors and things like that, or ARBs. So the point is that we physicians, as prominent as we may be in our society, owe a debt to the patients we treat. And we're called to a much higher order, and I believe under God, to serve those patients' needs and to give dignity and respect.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Dickerson, Dr. Graham has done an excellent job of laying out the Hippocratic Oath. He's done an excellent job of even putting that within a historical context, and even within a context identifying some of the specific elements of that oath. But for you, Dr. Dickerson, how accurate and are doctors in following this? And for you, it's as a practicing physician now, we're met with the challenge of many people walking out of a doctor's office and they don't understand the medication that they've been given, because the doctors have to have a patient in and out within a certain period of time. Even the ability to ask questions is on a time limit. So how accurate is this, or overall, how well do doctors follow that oath and that care and attention to their patients?
Well, unfortunately, Dr. White, most of my colleagues, we try to follow that guideline, but unfortunately, with managed care driving the economics, a lot of my colleagues are not able to do that. Actually, if you got 50 patients in a day, you have to see in a certain time frame, the patient may only get 10 to 15 minutes. However, going back to that Hippocratic Oath, the oath basically states that we should be treating that chart. We should be treating the fever that's associated with the chart. We should be treating that cancerous growth, as Dr. Graham stated. However, we should be treating that sick individual, that sick human being that's there in your office. However, when you're dealing with managed care and you got time restraints, sometimes that sick individual is not going to get the attention that they actually need. why they're there. And when that happens, referring back to the Hippocratic Oath, unfortunately, you're going to have situations in which that's going to impact that family. It's going to impact the economics of that family. That patient is not going to be able to work. The patient is not going to be able to provide for their families. So, with all being said, as Brother Kyle Bryant was relating to, you got cultural issues, you got stereotypical issues, you got patients relating back to thousands of years, hundreds of years ago that, us Black folks, we just want to come in and get pain medication. We may have a legitimate problem. So you may not get that particular narcotic. You may get a recommendation for over-the-counter Tylenol, but you're going to suffer. So therefore, it makes it tough to try to regulate different personal doctors and groups. Only thing that we do have is boards and our medical boards that try to streamline with patient complaints when they do get complaints, so they can actually monitor different doctors and practices. But our main goal as physicians, as Dr. Graham was basically saying, is the fact that we need to try to go in the business of preventing disease instead of working on cures. And so sometimes that can be very difficult. And hopefully with the vaccine that they're working on, hopefully don't affect the lower economically challenged folks like us minorities, giving them incentives just to get the vaccine that may not be properly tested or regulated like it should. And that's how I want to end that.
Wow. So once again, I appreciate you very much, Doc. So as you all see, as this backdrop that we're going into, and then put on top of that, we have clinical trials that are taking place. We have vaccinations that are unfolding. As you all have done an excellent job of articulating what normally takes place within the context of a vaccine being approved through a regular process. And now they're jumping over all kinds of roadblocks to get these vaccinations out. And so we have our concern with regard to the degree to which these patients understand what it is that they are taking. Brother Graham, I want to bounce back to you right quick and raise this question, because this is directly related to the clinical trials and vaccinations. There was a lot of concern around the flu vaccination. And we still have within the African American community the fear with regard to the flu vaccination. And then there's another shot that they tend to want women to take. And what's that shot? Right? So I think you're on mute, Doc. And so even within the context of women, we run into this the challenge of just get the shot. And then you add on top of that the marketing campaign that many pharmacies put forth. So how does that complicate things? Or what do you see, Dr. Graham, as a parallel between the concern around the vaccinations as with the concern around how African Americans respond to the flu vaccination? You're on mute. Dr. Graham, you're on mute. Is he muted?
I'm on mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. Go ahead.
So basically, like everything in life, there's a risk-benefit analysis, okay? So we have in the coronavirus, a virus that within our lifetime, certainly, and way back to the pandemics of the early 20th century, we have one of the worst coronaviruses we've ever seen. And by the way, the common cold is a coronavirus as well. So on a risk-benefit analysis, I think it's very important that two things happen. We can talk more next week, but that African Americans be included absolutely in the trial, because we are dying at twice the percentage due to COVID as we make up in the population. Two, I think we have to demand a true educational process about that. So people have to articulate the risk benefit of getting that. The current flu vaccine, and part of this is that the flu vaccine is based on the assumptions made of the virus that will cause the flu 12 to 18 months in advance. And there are some predictable misfires in that, okay? As far as a lot of the things that talk about the side effects of the flu vaccine, most of those are anecdotal. Most people tolerate the flu vaccine. Now, when we move into some of the other vaccines, HPV and things like that, there are other questions. But those, again, I think rather than try and give everybody on this call a overarching explanation of why you should take vaccines, what it speaks to is the doctor-patient relationship and the discussions that have to go in. So if you tell someone they have to have a vaccine on your way out the door, and they go to Google or go whatever, and they hear all these concerns, the doctor has missed the opportunity to try and get out front and say, well, these are the facts and these are the risk benefit. And I agreed with what the brother said. I mean, I just retired a year ago, so I had to do all the stuff with the EMRs too. But the point is that we as physicians, as busy as we say we are never too busy to find a way to communicate with a patient so that we sustain a physician-patient partnership. And I will defy any of my younger colleagues to tell me that that's not still possible, okay? I did it. My wife, who's also a retired physician, did it. And what is built on this whole physician-patient relationship is a trust relationship, which has really gone south. It's gone south not because of the intent, but because we use as an excuse a lot of the things we're doing with EMRs. So next week, when we start to really move into it, I want to emphasize, and I'll just give a tease of that, it is so important because of differences in genetic makeups that we be adequately represented in any of these trials to assure that there's any chance of efficacy for any of these. So I hope that in a roundabout way answers your question, brother.
Good, and it did. Thank you very much. I'm so excited as we get ready to hear Dr. Bass bring it home a little bit more around that historical paranoia and concern. But I will add to both of our doctors this nugget to get your minds ready for next week, and that's this concern. The vaccinations and the shots that you all as physicians recommend, you're recommending them because they've gone through the regular rigor. But now we are dealing with vaccinations and clinical trial. Even the clinical trial process has been shortened. And so the question becomes, how confident can a doctor be with trying to encourage, and we're going to save it for next week, but how confident can a doctor be in trying to encourage patients to participate in the clinical trials when to a degree this mess is unfolding before their eyes? And so this is going to be a great nugget, while on the one hand we argue for the importance of that clinical trial, and on the same hand the degree to which doctors are going to say, guess what, we don't know the long-term implications of this because we haven't done the clinical trials the way we normally do. And so I think this is really going to set the tone for the why or the why not aspect of this. We recognize the reality, but we still cannot bypass that. So that takes us right to Dr. Bass as a clinical psychologist in Bass. I'm going to raise the question is whether or not these fears, these concerns are valid, and how do we deal with it? And so I'm going to turn that on over to you.
And you want me to do this all in a minute, right? Okay, first of all, let me compliment the brothers. This has been a wonderful discussion. I'm so excited for what's going to happen next week, and hopefully before next year as we talk about vaccines. But let me put it all into context. Historically, what people have constantly said over and over and over again is that fear is false evidence appearing real. So I'm sure that somebody on this line has heard that concept before. But the only thing that fear is, if we all understand it, it's an emotional reaction, an unpleasant emotional reaction to a perceived threat. So where do these threats come from? The brothers have done a wonderful job. Dr. Wright, you did an excellent job talking about the history of where this fear generates. But another piece that was not mentioned that we really need to keep into context is the number of physicians that look like us. So if there is a historic untrust or distrust between us and other, why would I believe the other's treatment of me or possible vaccination of me? So we have this distrust going on. That's number one. And we really need to keep that in context. Brother Bryant talked about cultural competence. but it's also fair to say that a lot of the people who we patronize aren't culturally competent. I wish that I had a brother Graham or a brother Dr. Dickerson. I wish that I had one of you all growing up, but the truth is that the people in my neighborhood didn't. So I'm happy to see the brothers on the line. I'm happy to see all brothers who are practicing medicine. My wife is a practicing physician. So I get it. I get the need. But to answer your question, Brother Dr. White, it is very, very valid that we fear. And I'll wrap up my piece here. When it comes to being home before the street light comes on, many brothers on this line, and as I say that, I see you smiling because you probably heard and followed suit with coming home before the street lights come on. But where did that come from? I know growing up in DC, there was never this big fear that we had about coming home before the street lights came on. But knowing the history, my grandmother who grew up in South Carolina, she knew that you had to be home before dark, because if you didn't get home before dark, then something bad can happen to you. So she raised my mother, who was in DC, who didn't grow up in South Carolina. And my mother raised me. So now it's beyond us. So even if we didn't experience Tuskegee, even if we didn't experience all of those things that Dr. Wright so eloquently presented to us, we're still coming home before that street light comes on, right? We're taught that same way. So we have to be careful of the evidence that we're presented with, and we have to get the full story. So I'm excited to see what the doctors are going to lay out for us. I'm glad, Dr. White, you mentioned that all of the vaccines that will be presented to us have gone through rigorous trials. I am excited for us to once again get the full story, and I'm thinking we're going to get it next week. That's what I have. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Brother Bass. Brother Dumas, I see you just raised a great question that's going to be excellent bait for next week. So if you don't mind, go ahead and unmute and pose that question. Dr. Graham, Dr. Dickerson, as you assemble that team of medical doctors for that discussion, I think the question that Brother Dumas is about to pose, y'all don't have to hit it now, but get ready to address it on next week. Brother Dumas?
One of the things that I want to say is a public health professional. I do a lot of health communication, health education in the community. And I'm always hearing this question. So we're talking about vaccines, we're talking about cures. I don't even know the difference between two, not me personally, but the people that I in the community. So we really want to have some discussion next week about this whole thing. Is a vaccine the same thing as a cure, or is it something different? Even when we hear about, either getting a bacterial infection or a viral infection, some people talk about one thing can be treated, one thing can be cured. So really having an understanding of what does that really even mean? And so I kind of leave it right there, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss that in next week's chat with the Frat.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And Brother J. Kyle Bryant, you also raised a very powerful question in that post. So if you don't mind, go ahead and unmute and repose that question, because it's really within the context of the focus that you're on.
Are you talking about people being able to see themselves? Yeah, I just raised the issue of people do need to see themselves in the response efforts of these pandemics or emergency responses in order to trust the overall initiative or the process. The fact that we have fewer doctors or technical professionals who address the concern, we're not included in the marketing and outreach in many cases. So they're talking over our heads, and they don't get subject matter experts or community gatekeepers that are trusted by the community to be the voice box. And so like what's happened in downtown Atlanta when Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms got on the air, and then she invited local stakeholders like Killer Mike and T.I. to speak to the community who had some significant pull with the demographic that was out there protesting the most. That's the importance of having gatekeepers that are trusted by the impacted demographic.
Thank you very much.
Exactly.
I appreciate you. And go ahead, Dr. Bass.
And I should say one more thing. Another thing that we also need to keep into context is that we've been locked in our homes for 2 months now. So there's going to be a level of paranoia that comes with that. There's going to be a level of anxiety that comes with that. And as Brother Brian just mentioned a second ago, we saw a lot of that anxiety playing out with anger, that anger response, that rage response over the weekend. So we need to send up a prayer for all of us praying brothers. Just make sure that we pray for all of those kids who were out there and all of the families that were represented.
Thank you very much.
This is Brother Graham. Can I add one thing before?
Go ahead, Brother Graham.
All right. So one of the things that I and some other pulmonary and critical care specialists have done is the two bodies that most critical care people are at the front line. They're either in the American College of Chest Physicians or the American Thoracic Society. We have successfully lobbied within this week that we will have educational materials that are ethnocentric, and that we will answer many of these questions. So while I would be glad to present on that, I'm listening and taking notes on what's said now so that these be reflected. These will be coming out at a national level. And I'm fortunate to have about 5 other brothers working with those 2 organizations. So we hear you. We hear you. And I hope to have a little bit more of that next week.
Thank you. I appreciate you. And we have a historian on. Doug Evans is certainly the chapter historian. He's a Masonic historian. He's a Georgia historian. Doug, I want to ask you the simple question: what will history say about clinical trials, testing, COVID-19 in this particular time, in this given epoch?
Thank you, Dr. White. I think Dr. Graham really said it best when he talked about the cultural lack of trust with the patient and a doctor. And I think, we can just look on the news and we see the cultural lack of trust with a citizen and an officer, or we see the cultural lack of trust with a civilian and the court system. So the medical profession seems to be no different, but the stakes are higher. In the field that I work in is very interesting, Dr. White, because it's in the law enforcement science aspect and not the medical profession. And one of the things that we're seeing, Dr. Graham and Brother Dumas, we're seeing this new term, for me it's new, Brother Dumas, biosecurity. And one of the things that we're being told, we're hearing from other agencies is when we come back, there's a possibility that once the vaccine is on the market for COVID, that it's going to be mandated. And if you don't take the shot, you may lose your job. And so in this economic crisis that people are dealing with, nobody wants to lose a job in this economy. And so if you're faced with getting a shot that you don't know what it is versus losing your job, that's going to create a whole new level of distrust. Lastly, Dr. White, even when we look at the 400 people in Atlanta locked up last night during the COVID protest, I'm sorry, during the protests of the injustices that are going on. These young people are 400 going to be bailed out in the next 24 hours. We know that there's been a systemic historical forcing of those people to be tested for TB in the jail. And so if you don't want to get a TB test, can you think about the psychological trauma that's going to take place? And lastly, I hope Doc speaks to this next week, Dr. Graham, the disconnect culturally, historically of African-American people not being able to afford health care.
Thank you very much, Brother Evans. You're right on point. Again, I think our palates are getting pleased as we kind of build up to it. I'll be remiss with all the coverage that we're seeing on TV. And with that compounded, the coverage that we're seeing with regard to the discussion around clinical trials and vaccinations. We have Brother Curtis Bunn, who was on with us, an award-winning writer, a reporter, an author, and who covers and has captured all that we're seeing in this particular period of time. And so, Brother Bunn, I just want to ask you with regard to the media coverage of the clinical trials, the vaccinations, COVID-19, give us your perspective of how it's all being presented in the media right now.
Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity. I think this speaks to diversity and inclusion. I've been a journalist for a long time. When I started in 1983 at the National Association of Black Journalists Conventions, we always talked about the value of having African American reporters so that we could cover events that matter to us. Because if we weren't there to do it, they wouldn't be done. So I think what you're seeing now is a case of where I'm writing about COVID-19 and how it impacts our community almost every week or a couple times a week. It was a pleasure to write about this chat with the Frat a few weeks ago, because I identified it as something that was unique, important, and each week has elevated itself to be something that is invaluable. And so to see it continue now 9 weeks straight with the 10th week on deck is critical. I'm writing right now, and I've been in touch with Dr. Bass and Dr. Graham. I'm writing a story right now for next week about what we were talking about, clinical trials, and the importance of us participating in them. But of course, that blind spot of the Tuskegee experiment, any other case, even beyond that, even more elementary, is Uncle Johnny went to the doctor, he was fine, and then he came out, and now all of a sudden he went downhill. Black parents have shared those kind of stories to their kids over the years, and it creates this whole idea that you can't trust doctors. And in a lot of sense, so it was very enlightening for me to listen to everybody talk about the history of the Hippocratic Oath and what the responsibilities are of the doctors. And we know that these trials need to be, you have to have your consent to participate in them. And I thought it was very important to say that not only do you have to have the consent and sign the paper, but you have to have continual conversations with people so that they truly understand what it's about, and that you can opt out of it when you want to. So that's sort of an aside from the question. I think the media is going to cover this in terms of the Black population only if they're Black reporters who have a conscience about doing so. And it kind of speaks to the value of diversity and inclusion. So it's been fascinating for me. Dr. Dumas pointed out something about the difference between vaccination and a cure. And I've been writing about Meharry has an antiviral drug at the NIH right now that they believe can be something that is different from a vaccine. It will attack the drug once it's in your body and kill it. So once you test positive, you won't get sick. So if it pans out, it's in the very early stages at this point, but that's the idea of it. So the differentiating between an antiviral drug, the vaccine, a cure, all of those things are important to know, important information to know. And I think the disinformation and misinformation and lack of information that's being spread through the media has resulted in so much confusion and a lack of information and stability in people and how they move forward every day as we deal with this continual pandemic.
Thank you very much, Brother Bond. We are going to almost be compelled to challenge you to gather Frat who are in the journalist world. Jerry Askin, I know, for example, who's covering this thing in Florida. We're going to almost be compelled to bring those journalists together along with Brother J. Carl Bryan to have this discussion in terms of the media coverage. We're going to close and move towards this with our special guest, Brother Richmond, to give some final points and views with regard to this discussion and dialogue.
Thank you. I just want to stress that successful resolution to this process and to what we're experiencing will require a very dynamic, multi-pronged approach. And so with that said, the very foundation of this is education. So I would encourage all of our listeners and all of our viewers to not just sit on TV or sit on the news and listen to what's being fed to you, but I would encourage you to find as many different sources as you can, whether it be radio, news, or newspaper, and then corroborate things that we're sharing here with you today, but then also that you're receiving from other ends as well. Because not all information that you receive is going to be factual all the time. The other thing is that we have to demand accountability from the top down. So accountability and responsibility. And that starts with everybody voting. So in order to get people into positions that look like you and to make decisions that have you in favor or keep you in mind, we have to exercise at the polls. So that's all.
Thank you very much. So once again, I'm going to say to Dr. Dickerson, Dr. Graham, you all got your hands full. Where we are right now and the challenge that we're confronted with, this is part one of a two-part piece around vaccinations and the clinical trials. And just here, we have some new questions that have been posed. I think what our public health expert, Brother Dumas, has presented in terms of, are we working toward a cure? And making those distinctions. I think you all actually literally had your hands full. Whether or not by the time this two-part series, we have the clarity and people are comfortable or not, it's unknown. But as for the Brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha Omicron Phi Lambda chapter, it is our challenge and our goal to bring this information to each and every one of you so that you would put it in the historical context. One of the things from a clinical standpoint we recognize is that we have to validate. We must validate the issues, concerns, and fears of our people. And to invalidate it is to set us back. And so hopefully for everyone who's watched today that we've done a good job of setting the tone, putting it in the historical context, sharing with you about the medical ethics, the work around the physician's response to that oath, the historical context of all of this. Hopefully we have certainly done a good job of easing those fears that Dr. Bass has talked about. And so we thank everyone for joining us on today. Hopefully this was riveting and exciting for you. And as always, we're going to close out with our brother, our president, Brother Marshall Taggart, with some parting words. Brother Taggart.
Brothers, hope everybody's doing fine this evening. Again, I apologize for not being stationary. Of course, taking care of some duties here as we talk about this very important subject related to vaccination. So I'm glad that we were able to have Brother Dr. Oliver Richmond III on a call today to definitely bring words and some knowledge for everyone to know. Thank you for all of our speakers. And again, we look forward to you coming to our next session. And Brother White, that session will be?
Again, it's part 2 dealing with the vaccinations. We're going to talk specifically about the clinical trials. So the trials and tribulations of clinical testing, we're going to certainly go into. And so we look forward to certainly seeing everyone get involved in this. So once again, on behalf of the Brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, Omicron Phi Lambda chapter, during this, our 33rd year of celebrating our existence, on behalf of this outstanding, dynamic, interdisciplinary team, Brother Terry Dickerson, Brother Marcus Dumas, Brother Larry Graham, Brother J. Kyle Bryant, Brother Christopher Bass, and Brother Darren Wright. And once again, I'm Brother Gary White. We thank you all for joining in. Hopefully there is something that we said has inspired you and has triggered you and have challenged you to do additional research as we continue to attack both COVID-19 and the vaccination clinical situation. Once again, thank you all very much. Take care. God bless. And if Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll see you all next week. Brothers, throw them up if you don't mind. All right. Thank you all very much. Take care and God bless.
Peace. Good job.